Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Anne, Susan, and Avo. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and collections found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip. No subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax with a listener request that combines travel, history, and architecture. Old Country Inns of England, by Henry P. Maskell and Edward W. Gregory, with illustrations by the authors. First published in 1911 by L.C. Page & Company, Boston. Let's begin. Preface. Why do your guidebooks tell us about nothing but churches and manor houses? Such was the not altogether unjustifiable complaint of an American friend whose motor car was undergoing repairs. He was stranded in a sleepy old market town of winding streets, overhanging structures, and oddly set gables, where every stone and carved beam seemed only waiting an interpreter to unfold its story. In the following pages, we have attempted a classification and description of the inns, which not only sheltered our forefathers when on their journeys, but served as their usual places for meeting and recreation. The subject is by no means exhausted. All over England, there are hundreds of other old inns quite as interesting as those which find mention, and it is hoped that our work may prove for many tourists the introduction to a most fascinating study. Thoughtful men, including earnest churchmen, such as the Bishop of Birmingham and the Reverend H.R. Gamble, are asking the question whether the old inns should be allowed to disappear. The public house as a national institution has still its purposes to fulfill, and a few suggestions have therefore been included with a view of showing how it might easily be adapted to modern social needs. Old Country Inns of England. Chapter 1. Manorial Inns. Which among the thousand of old inns to be met with on our country roads has a right to be called the oldest? There are many claimants. The title deeds of the Saracen's Head at Newark refer back to 1341. Local antiquaries cite documentary evidence to prove that the Seven Stars at Manchester existed before the year 1356. Simond Potin, who founded St. Catherine's Hospital for Poor Pilgrims at Rochester in 1316, is described as of the Crown Inn. A Nottingham ballad relates the adventures of one Dame Rose, who kept the ram in that town in the days of good King Stephen. Then we have the witness of the German ambassador to the comfort and excellence of the fountain at Canterbury when he lodged there in 1299, on the occasion of the marriage of King Edward I to Margaret of France. Nay, the legend runs that within its walls the four murderers of St. Thomas arranged the last details of their plot in 1170, and that the wife of Earl Godwin stayed at this inn in 1029. But what are all these compared with the Fighting Cocks at St. Albans, said to be the oldest inhabited house in England? A few years ago, its signboard modestly chronicled the fact that it had been rebuilt after the flood. Nevertheless, we can safely assert that no English inn has a history of more than 800 years, and that very few hostelries can trace their independent existence to a period earlier than the 14th century. Until the towns had acquired the rights of self-government, and trade had in consequence begun to expand, there was little occasion for inns. England under the Norman kings was a purely agricultural country, with scattered villages where dependent tillers of the soil grouped their clay-walled thatched hovels around church and manor house. Even ancient towns, with a record of 1,000 years, were merely rather larger villages on a navigable river or a crossroad. Foreign merchant ships were just beginning to call once more at the seaports on the chance of trade. Traveling on the roads was attended with serious dangers and inconveniences. Robbers abounded, some not so courteous and discriminating as the legendary Robin Hood. Armed retainers at the tail of some noble lord's retinue were occasionally not above a little highway robbery on their own account, and if the victim failed to escape his assailant, his remedy at law was precarious at best. Such a band, if sufficiently numerous, would even go so far as to attack the king's officers sent in pursuit of them. The journey might at any time be brought to an abrupt conclusion because the travelers' horses and carts were forcibly commandeered by the purveyor to the king or some great noble. The roads themselves were in a disgraceful state, full of deep ruts, holes, and quagmires, quite impassable in wet weather. Their repair was left to chance or the goodwill of neighboring owners. In the towns they were encumbered with heaps of refuse. The rolls of Parliament from the reign of Edward I onward contained numerous petitions for a regular highway tax. A curious illustration of the lack of any systematic authority over the roads, even as late as the 15th century, is preserved in the records of the manor of Aylesbury. A local miller named Richard Booz needed some ramming clay for the repair of his mill. Accordingly, his servants dug a great pit in the middle of the road, 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep, and so left it to become filled with water from the winter rains. A glover from Leighton Buzzard, on his way home from market, fell in and was drowned. Charged with manslaughter, the miller pleaded that he knew no place wherein to get the kind of clay he required except on the high road. He was acquitted. Furthermore, all England was parceled out into manors, each a little principality in itself, presided over by a lord, who in practice possessed summary rights over life and property within his domain. A stranger might be called upon to undergo a very searching examination to account for his presence in the neighborhood. Most of the inhabitants were forbidden to leave the domain without the consent of their lord. Not that this was a great hardship. The idea of a journey rarely occurs to the bucolic mind, and fully half the rural population of England in these days of cheap railway excursions are content to spend their lives within their native parish, or at any rate, never venture beyond the market town. In every manor there was a manor house, the residence of the lord and the center of the life of the community. It was usually quite a simple building on the main street near the church. Here were held the manor courts, view of frank pledge, assize of bread and ale and other quaint customs, some of which have come down to our own days. Hither at hocktide and harvest would come the tenants and their wives, bringing their own platters, cups, and napkins for their feast. Such few travelers as were benighted on the road, small merchants or peddlers going to a local fair, a knight or squire on his way to court, king's messengers and officials, would naturally put up at the manor house. Hospitality was so rarely called for that it was willingly afforded, just as it is at an Australian homestead in the backwoods. One more sleeping place on the rushes in the hall, another seat at the common table, above or below the salt, according to the hostler's estimate of the guest's condition in life, was no great matter. Doubtless each in his own degree made his present to the hostler in the morning. The butler in a country house still expects his solatium from the parting guest. By the middle of the 14th century, the roads had become more frequented, and it was no longer the fashion for the lord to reside in the comparatively humble manor house. The cost of living had seriously increased. The nobility were impoverished by attendance at court, the foreign wars, and their crowd of retainers. So the lord retired to his more secluded castle or country seat, leaving strangers to be entertained at the manor house by a steward, who afterwards was replaced by a regular innkeeper as tenant. Throughout these changes, the family crest or arms remained on the front of the building, or sometimes the manor house was turned to other uses, and an inn was built close by, and the coat of arms hung over the door in order to induce travelers to transfer their custom thither. Such is the origin of the official inn throughout feudal Europe. But in the Black Forest and the Tyrol, the process was sometimes completely reversed. As the nobility became poorer, they parted with their estates and turned innkeepers. One can still now and then make the surprising discovery that mine host is by birth a baron, actually entitled to bear the arms above his door, and that it is his ancestors who sleep under those magnificent marble tombs in the minster hard by. Inns with heraldic emblems for their signs, or called the Norfolk Arms, Dorset Arms, Neville Arms, according to the local landowner, abound everywhere, the actual arms scarcely ever being emblazoned on account of the heavy tax on armorial bearings. But it is not easy to trace their connection with the manor house. Manors have been alienated over and over again. With each change, the sign on the inn has usually been repainted with the arms of the new owner. One of the few exceptions is the tiger at Linfield, which carries us back to the Mickleburns of the 14th century. For a characteristic example of a manorial inn, we must invite our readers to visit the sleepy town of Midhurst, venerable in its winding streets of projecting upper stories, deeply molded eaves and gables, a town nestling among the gentler slopes of the South Downs, on the banks of that sweetest and most musical of trout streams, the Sussex Rother. Here is an old inn, far away from the great roads which no vandal has yet ventured to rebuild. The older portion dates from about 1430, and no doubt stands on the site of the original manor house of the de Bones. It is an excellent example of an early timber-framed house of the better class, with massive old oak ceilings, ingle nooks, and down fires. The old fireplaces and recessed ovens are pronounced by experts to be genuine 14th century work. A very large addition was made in 1650, when the stables were also built. This latter portion will not be regretted by the visitor who loves more comfort and cheery surroundings than is possible in a conscientiously preserved 14th century hotel. In clearing away the paint from one of the paneled rooms at the Spread Eagle, an inscription was discovered, "The Queen's Room," possibly referring to the much-traveled Queen Elizabeth, who was entertained marvelously, nay, rather excessively, by Sir Anthony Browne, 1st Viscount Montague, at Coudray in 1591. A melancholy interest attaches to the sign of the Spread Eagle. It was the crest of the Montague family, which came to an end in 1793, with the drowning of the last Viscount Montague at Schaffhausen on the Rhine, in the very same week that his splendid mansion at Coudray was destroyed by fire. It is worth noting that the double-gabled house in the foreground of our first picture of the Spread Eagle, once also an inn, now a cozy temperance hotel, was built early in the 17th century by an ancestor of Richard Cobden. On royal manors, the crown was more frequently employed as a distinguishing mark of the manorial hall than the royal arms. Inns having for their signs the King's Arms have usually assumed this title during the Reformation period, when the royal arms were ordered to be set up in the churches. An exception is the King's Arms Hotel at Godalming, which has every reason to claim to be the original inn of the royal manor. The present building is not much more than 2 centuries old, a fine substantial example of red brick domestic architecture in the reign of good Queen Anne. An oak-paneled room is shown to visitors as that in which Peter, the great Tsar of Russia, slept during his visit to England. The landlord's bill on this occasion is preserved as a curiosity in the Bodleian Library. The items of the bill are as follows: breakfast, half a sheep, a quarter of lamb, 10 pullets, 12 chickens, 3 quarts of brandy, 6 quarts of mulled wine, 7 dozen of eggs, with salad in proportion. At dinner, the company had 5 ribs of beef weighing 3 stone, 1 sheep weighing 50 pounds, 3 quarters of lamb, a shoulder and loin of veal boiled, 8 pullets, 8 rabbits, 2½ dozen of sack, and 1 dozen of claret. The number of guests was 21. There is another old inn at Godalming with the sign of 3 lions. We have not been able to obtain any authentic information about its history, and it may be only a coincidence that the royal arms before Edward III quartered the arms of France consisted of 3 lions on a shield. Even if inns that can prove their authentic manorial origin are few and far between, this class of hostelry must once have been the most important of all. The nomenclature of the 13th century manor is preserved in every detail of the modern inn. The hostler remains as the ostler, who now usually confines his attention to four-footed visitors. The chamberlain has changed his sex, though only since the days of Sir Roger de Coverley, and has become the chambermaid. In most old manor houses, provisions, wine, and ale were served from a special department close to the porch and called the bower, from Norse bur, meaning buttery. Frequenters of a modern inn resort for the same purpose to the bar. Lastly, the presiding genius in every hotel or tavern, no matter how humble, is invariably referred to as the landlord. The very word inn, like the French hotel, anciently implied the town residence of a nobleman. The inns of court were nearly all of them houses of the nobility, converted for the purpose of lodging the law students there. The same remark applies to the inns which preceded the cloistered colleges of our older universities. But we usually know the English inn by a much nobler name, a name which carries us back to an age many generations before there were any manorial lords to the tribal chief, and beyond the tribal chieftain to the common dwelling of our forefathers. We generally refer to it as the public house. It is the one secular place of resort where we can all forget our social differences, where millionaire and pauper, nobleman and navvy can hobnob together on equal ground if they care to do so. The public house opens its doors to every well-behaved citizen without distinction of persons. It is the abiding witness to the common brotherhood of man, for the public house is not merely an institution to provide lodging and refreshment for the individual wayfarer, nor yet a shop for the sale of certain specific liquids. It is a place where men can meet to entertain each other and converse with their fellow men on equal terms. As such, it is hateful to the sectary, who would fain see men sorted out into exclusive coteries for the airing of their own opinions and class grievances. Chapter 2: Monastic Inns. Rural England, during the 2 centuries after the Conquest, was practically under martial law. The hardy men of Kent and the Vale of Holmesdale were strong enough to retain some of their ancient rights and privileges. Beyond these districts, local government was suppressed, and a military despotism took its place, administered often by half-civilized chieftains. One influence alone was formidable enough to modify and soften the crude tyranny of the feudal system, that of the monasteries. The religious orders were the only class who had directly profited by the new regime to increase their power. Hitherto merely national, they now became, in a way, part of an international system. Not that they ceased to be patriotic. In the combinations against regal misrule which produced the great charters, bishops and abbots threw in their lot heartily with the lay barons. But in themselves, they formed at this time an almost independent authority, with special privileges dangerous to meddle with, because behind them was the universal church and its temporal head, the Pope, now just reaching the zenith of his authority. It was the religious orders that saved England from barbarism. Each monastery was a kind of impregnable city, within which all the graces of civilization were fostered. Here learning, literature, and art were diligently studied. Rich and poor, bondmen and free, were welcomed as scholars if only they proved their ability to profit by the tuition. A certain number of manors were allotted to the church, and this number was constantly being increased by royal or private benefaction. The tenants of ecclesiastical manors, more especially the villeins or serfs, were in these early times much better treated than those subject to the secular lords. The tenures were generally easy. Labor customs could be commuted for a small sum of money, and the serfs could acquire freedom on very moderate terms. Enlightened forms of lease were introduced. The monks were the great agriculturists of the Middle Ages, and so were concerned in the maintenance of facilities for traffic. Apart from this, their one duty to the state was to satisfy the trinota necessitas, particularly the care of roads and bridges. This was considered a pious and meritorious duty, often rewarded with special indulgences. Such undertakings were a work of mercy, in that they befriended the unfortunate traveler. The roads adjoining a monastic estate were usually kept in fair condition as compared with those in other districts. The first London Bridge was built by the prior of St. Mary Overy. Another great endowed bridge, that over the Medway at Rochester, owes its origin to the great St. Dunstan. Nearly all the picturesque Gothic bridges which still survive were the work of the monks. Traveling was in many other ways directly fostered by the monasteries. Communications were constantly passing between the various houses of an order, many of which were on the continent. Authority for the election of a new abbot or a change in the statutes would have to be obtained from Rome. The 2 centuries after the conquest witnessed a continual rebuilding and beautifying of the abbey churches. Materials had to be brought from a distance, skilled artists engaged, rich plate, metalwork, and ornate vestments procured for the altar service. All this was a great stimulus to trade. The doors of the monastery were open to all comers, and there were many reasons why hospitality would be sought at a religious house, in preference to the manorial inn. Rich people resorted to them because of their comfort and security, the poor because there was nothing to pay. No unpleasant questions were likely to be asked, so we find Quentin Durward in the novel of Sir Walter Scott, which gives us such an excellent idea of the period he describes, always avoiding the public inns and taking refuge at the monasteries in order to minimize the risk of his secret mission being betrayed. Most of these houses had been endowed by the king or nobles, and their descendants considered themselves at home within the precincts. These noble guests, especially when they were accompanied by a miscellaneous retinue, were apt to be rather too roisterous and turbulent for the cloister. A statute of Edward I forbids anyone to lodge at a religious house without the formal invitation of the superior, unless he be the founder, and then he must conform closely to the rules and regulations. The poor alone were to retain the right to the grace of hospitality free of charge. Numerous later statutes were enacted with the same end in view. The monks of Battle rebuilt their guest house outside the abbey gate, where it still remains as a most beautiful example of 15th century half-timber work. Long before this time, however, another expedient had been devised to cope with the increasing crowd of travelers needing rest and refreshment. Whenever we come across an inn bearing the sign of the Bull, it is worthwhile to inquire whether there was formerly a religious house in the neighborhood. We have examined into the history of upwards of 100 bulls, and even where definitive proof has not been forthcoming, the circumstantial evidence has always been sufficient to arouse suspicion. It is especially a common sign in connection with a nunnery. Thus, the inns of this name at Dartford, Barking, and Malling, all three very ancient, belong to the local abbeys. At Hythe on the Medway, a manor of Malling Abbey, there is a Bull Inn, and another at Deal in Berkshire, which was the property of the Prioress of Goring. Elfrida, the mother-in-law of Edward the Martyr, founded a nunnery at Reading in expiation of the base murder of that prince. This nunnery was abolished owing to scandals in the 12th century, but a Bull Inn still flourishes near the site of the Abbey Gate. At Newington, next Sittingbourne, the prioress was found strangled in her bed, and the nuns were removed elsewhere, but the Bull remains as the chief inn to this day. In deeds of the 14th and 15th centuries relating to the Bull at Barking, this house is referred to as Tectum vel hospitium vocatum le Bowl. Bowl is the old French equivalent of the Latin bulla, a seal from which it is clear that no bovine connection is implied by the sign, but merely that the inn was licensed under the seal of the abbey. Some antiquaries have suggested that such inns were tied houses where ale of monastic brewing was sold, reminding us of the current explanation of the XX and XXX marks on barrels of strong ale as having been originally the seals guaranteeing the quality in the days when the monks were the leading brewers. It is true that the peculiar virtue of the wells at Burton-on-Trent was known at a very early period, and that the ale brewed in the local abbey was an article of commerce when Richard I was king. Tied houses were not uncommon in the Middle Ages. Witness the Bear Inn in Southwark, leased in 1319 by Thomas Drinkwater, wine merchant to James Beaufleur, on condition that he purchased all his liquor from the said Thomas Drinkwater, who agreed to furnish all needful flagons, mugs, cutlery, and linen. On the other hand, very few collegiate houses brewed ale beyond the needs of their own consumption, and we have not yet come across any lease binding their tenants. Mention is often made of a brewhouse attached to the inn. As to the marks on the barrels, a prosaic solution is that these are merely excise marks of the 17th century, when beer was taxed according to its strength. Whatever the terms of its original lease may have been, the Bull profited by monastic favor and protection to grow into a big and prosperous establishment. It is nearly always the leading hostelry of the town. 2 centuries ago, the Bull at St. Albans was described by Baskerville as the largest in England, but with the decay of the coaching trade it has retired into private life. Mr. Jingle's recommendation of the Bull at Rochester, good house, nice beds, might be fairly applied to nearly every Bull Inn of our acquaintance. The sign is a symbol of steady-going, respectable, old-fashioned ways, where comfort is not sacrificed to economy, and where the cellar and kitchen are alike irreproachable. Any remnants of antiquity are concealed behind a broad Georgian facade, for good business entails frequent rebuilding. The Bull at Barking is now to all appearance a quite modern hotel. Few would guess that its history could be traced for 700 years, and that twice during that time it has been occupied by a single family for more than a century. In 1636, it was sold to St. Margaret's Hospital in Westminster for the sum of 1 shilling, and therefore continues to be collegiate property. To avoid confusion, we must remind the reader that the bull's head denotes the crest of the Nevilles, or occasionally Anne Boleyn. The pied bull is a whimsical sign found near a cattle market or bull ring. A few inns, too, received the name of the bull in Elizabethan or Jacobean times, when astrology was popular, and Taurus happened to be the house ascendant in the orrery figure. Thus, in Ben Jonson's Alchemist, a townsman born in Taurus given the bull, or the bull's head, in Aries the ram. Sometimes in place of the official seal, the monastic inn bore for its sign a picture or carving of a religious mystery. Outside the Abbey Gate at Bury St. Edmunds is the Angel Inn, once called the Angelus or Salutation. There is another Angel Inn, probably monastic, in Guildford. Both of these are famous for their beautiful early English crypts, groined and vaulted in stone. The Angel at Grantham belonged to the Knights Templars. At Addington in Kent, the Angel has a very odd staircase of great antiquity, each tread being a solid log of timber, and an underground passage which local gossip connects with a priory at Ryorsh. Another monastic Angel at Basingstoke is said to be the subject of Ben Jonson's coarse epigram, inspired by the departure of his hostess, Mrs. Hope, and her daughter Prudence. The cock is an emblem of St. Peter, and the cross keys are frequently found. The most interesting inn in the city of Westminster was the Cock and Tabard in Tottle Street, pulled down in 1871. It dated from the reign of Edward III, and it was here, according to Stowe, that the workmen engaged in the completion of the Abbey Church were paid. From its yard 2 centuries later, the first stagecoach to Oxford was started. Battle Abbey possessed several Star Inns, the best known of which was the Star at Alfriston, which may either be named after Our Lady, Star of the Sea, or after the Earl of Sussex, one of whose badges was the star. Semi-religious signs such as the angel, star, and mitre are not always monastic, nor need they imply pre-Reformation origin. The Angel at Islington is, comparatively speaking, a mushroom upstart. Under the sign of the Angel, Jacob's, a Jew, opened in 1650 one of the first coffee houses in the parish of St. Peter, Oxford. A pious Roundhead might find chapter and verse for the sign, and gloat over the conceit of entertaining an angel, perhaps not unawares. Puritan sects have been known to give the official title of angel to their itinerant preachers. The Cock Tavern in Fleet Street, in spite of the splendid gilt chanticleer generally attributed to Grinling Gibbons, has no connection with St. Peter. An advertisement printed in the Intelligence of 1665 shows that its old name was the Cock and Bottle. Cock is still used in some parts of the country for the spigot or tap in a barrel, and the sign was simply a short way of informing the bibulous that they could obtain here ale both on draught and in bottle. A monastic inn far exceeding in worldwide fame all others is that Tabard Inn in the Borough, whence 500 years ago 30 merry pilgrims set forth on a springtide morning on their 3 days' journey along the old Watling Street to Canterbury. The Tabard was a speculation of the Abbot of Hyde, Winchester, and no doubt a profitable one, for its landlords were always men of character and substance who would attract guests of good class. Harry Bailey, Chaucer's friend, represented Southwark in 2 successive parliaments, and another landlord, William Rutton, sat in Parliament for East Grinstead in 1529. Built in 1307, together with a hostel for the clergy of the monastery, it remained in much the same condition as when Chaucer sang its praises until about 1602. The stone-colored wooden gallery, in front of which hung a picture of the Canterbury pilgrimage attributed to Blake, and the so-called Pilgrim's Room were probably of this period. The rest was rebuilt after the Great Fire of Southwark, 1676. 20 years ago, all was demolished, and a gin shop on its site of modern, vulgar red brick mock Gothic absurdly claims the title of the Old Tabard. One religious order never attempted to divert the increasing stream of guests into the inns. With the Knights Hospitallers, all comers were welcomed. The entertainment of strangers remained their chief duty. The accounts of their house in Clerkenwell for the year 1337 show that they had spent more than their whole revenue, at least £8,000, the reason being, as the prior explains, the hospitality given to strangers, members of the royal family and other grandees, who all expected to be entertained in accordance with their rank. A noble would occasionally send his whole suite to the convent in order to save expense. The knight monks, finding no Paynim to demolish, became an order of hotel keepers, and travelers never failed to profit by the generous fare provided in their numerous establishments. At Dorking, when the knights departed, the innkeeper took their place and continues to keep up the old traditions. The White Cross is now the White Horse, though not from any similarity of names, but because the Earls of Arundel, and afterwards the Dukes of Norfolk, were lords of the manor. In later life, the White Horse was a famous coaching house, and rebuildings have apparently destroyed any feature older than, say, 3 centuries. Perhaps it was in the yard of this house, where a noble old vine spreads green fragrance over the great white gables, that Charles Dickens met the individual who sat for the portrait of Tony Weller. Deep underneath the building are a series of vaults cut out of the sandstone, maybe a relic of the Hospitallers. In one of the lowest is a curious old well. Tradition has it that these cellars were used in the smuggling days. To lovers of the road, the quaint gables and broad oriels of the White Horse are no mean landmark, for they are the destination of a real old-fashioned coach and four running hither from Charing Cross daily during the summer months. Chapter 3. The Hospices. Mention of the Knights Hospitallers brings us by an easy stage to pilgrimages. It was the original purpose of this order to keep open the route to the holy places, and to assist the sick and needy pilgrims on their journey. Some pious merchants of Amalfi obtained permission to found a refuge for destitute pilgrims to the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem about the middle of the 11th century. At first, the Brethren of St. John were content with nursing the sick and relieving the hungry in the Jerusalem hospice, and in this work of mercy earned the toleration of Saladin when he once more captured Jerusalem from the Christians. But at this time they had already taken to the sword and had become very active and trenchant members of the church militant. Rich in glowing romance and stirring adventure is the story of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and the many expeditions to regain possession of the Holy Land. We are more concerned with the ordinary Englishman. While the crusade ensured the absence for a season of a goodly number of turbulent lords and truculent retainers, he was at liberty to visit the shrines of his own country. At Glastonbury was the chapel of St. Joseph of Arimathea and the Sacred Thorn, as venerable as anything in Christendom. Hardly less ancient was the shrine of the first martyr, St. Alban, while at Durham he might kneel in reverence before the relics of the great St. Cuthbert and the venerable Bede. St. Ethelbert of Hereford and St. Edmund at Bury St. Edmunds would equally invite the suffrages of their clients. Pilgrimages played their part, and a very important one too, in the making of England. They gave the ordinary man an opportunity to travel. A subject race of stolid peasantry, who otherwise would never have left the confines of their lord's estate, were encouraged to go on a long journey and see what the world outside was like. If any man wished to go on a pilgrimage, he needed only a scrip and staff consecrated by his parish priest. So furnished, no lord could detain him. By virtue of his pious and meritorious vow, he would find friends and assistants everywhere. The most desperate characters would respect the sanctity of his profession. If a robber found that his victim was a pilgrim, he restored all that he had taken. During his absence, any monastery was prepared to take charge of his affairs, nor could any legal proceedings be taken against him until his return. Pilgrimages were the thin end of the wedge which was destined to shatter the whole feudal system. They sowed the seeds of the great revolt of the peasants under Richard II. They instilled into the heart of the people that roving, restless spirit that made the Englishman the most successful colonizer the world has ever known. Under the very curfew, the torch of liberty was smoldering. It is significant that nearly all the places of popular pilgrimage established between the 11th and 14th centuries had a political basis. The figure of the last king of the old English stock stood out bright against the darkness of England, trodden underfoot by the foreigner. Memories of peace, prosperity, and independence gathered round his name, and while men were clamoring for the good laws of Edward the Confessor, throngs of pilgrims hastened to implore intercession of the saint. Today his tomb in the Abbey of Westminster is the most hallowed spot for every true Englishman. a century later, the scene of the martyrdom at Canterbury was attracting even vaster crowds. Nearly 1/10 of the whole population of the country resorting hither for worship in a single year. We may well believe that they came to reverence St. Thomas of Canterbury as not merely a devout ascetic, but as the first commoner of English birth who dared to brave the absolute power of the king. There were several quite unauthorized pilgrimages of political origin. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, who had headed the barons in their agitation against Edward II and the royal favorites, became, after his execution, a saint in popular estimation. Pilgrimages were organized to Pontefract, as well as to a picture of the saint, set up in St. Paul's Cathedral in spite of royal protests. By a strange revulsion of sentiment, the tomb of Edward II, himself one of the least desirable of kings, became a place of pilgrimage, and a special inn had to be built at Gloucester to accommodate those who wished to make their prayers and vows on his behalf. The good Simon de Montfort, although he died under excommunication, was accounted a saint, and Latin hymns and versicles were composed for his office. Of all the devotional pilgrimages, none could stand in comparison with Our Lady of Walsingham. It may be regarded as illustrative of the English character that this shrine grew into notoriety without any startling miracle from simple and homely beginnings. A pious Norfolk lady caused a little wooden house to be built in imitation of the Holy House at Nazareth, and invited her neighbors to join with her there in meditation on the mystery of the Immaculate Conception. With time and a great concourse of pilgrims came an elaboration of legend and a variety of foreign accessories, maybe exaggerated in the half-satirical description given by Erasmus. But when the true, unvarnished story of Walsingham comes to be written, it will show that to the very end a degree of sober good sense controlled the authorities there. And before we leap into the 14th century and a certain set of tales from Canterbury, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Old Country Inns of England, all of which makes me want to go to England and stay in an old country inn. But that will have to wait for another time. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the engravings created by the authors, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.